Okay, aboutness, the basics. So there's going to be three of these webinars. One will just be reviewing some of the main outlines of how aboutness works in my system. A little bit of a comparison, maybe with Kit Fine's system, and some simple applications. The second will be the notion of a way for something to happen, and in particular, a way for something to be true is going to be playing a really big role. And so there's going to be a fair amount to be said about ways. That's going to be the second lecture, and then the third will be applying all this stuff to a number of puzzles and paradoxes, skeptical paradoxes, sorites, maybe a bit about the liar, stuff like that. Okay, thank you. All right, so we're all used to thinking of aboutness, and I guess I first heard the word aboutness taking classes as a graduate student from John Searle. He loved the word, and he would tell us oftentimes, and I don't know where various examples come from, but that what's marvelous about the mind is that you're able to stand in a relationship to something very far away. And he emphasized that we can think of Vienna, and then he also emphasized that, which we'll come back to, that we can keep on thinking of it even if Vienna stops existing, and even if Vienna never existed and it was always a hoax. So this is probably what comes to mind for most people when they think about aboutness, a relation between thoughts or sentences and objects in the world. And sometimes people add, well, states of affairs could be objects. You could think about Vienna and also about its being a lovely place. I'll use the word object sort of broadly, and I'll be thinking about regular old objects. I mean, the kind of thing that a name would stand for. For us, it's going to be instead a relation between thoughts or sentences and ways for things to be. So if you might think of them as sort of properties a world could have, or ways of grouping worlds. But this doesn't exclude ways that a particular object O might be, and that's going to be the device we use to try to reconcile the Brentano relation with our relation. So of all the ways for things to be, and of course there can be complete ways for things to be. That's what Salmon talks about in a famous paper, ways for the world to be. There's also partial ways for things to be. One way for things to be is for my arm to be itchy. That kind of leaves a lot unsettled, but it is a way for things to be. And we'll mostly be focusing on partial ways for things to be. But of all of the ways for things to be, which figure in the subject matter of a particular sentence S? And the answer is, well, S is true in some worlds and it's false in other worlds. But certain aspects of those worlds are peculiarly relevant to S as being true or false. And we're going to be focusing on those aspects when we're looking at the subject matter of S. So the ways for things to be, which figure in S's subject matter, are its ways of being true or false in the worlds where it is true or false. Here's a very rough motivation for this. Suppose we think, following Lewis, of subject matters, at least in the first instance, as ways of grouping worlds together, where worlds are equivalent or similar if the relevant, well, if they're alike where that subject matter is conserved. So here we need to be talking about sentential subject matter yet, just subject matters in general. Now let's bring in subject matters of sentences. If two worlds are exactly alike where the subject matter of a sentence is concerned, then you might think, well, they can't differ in how S holds or fails. So maybe take the sentence, I have a bicycle. Worlds where I have the same bicycle and got it the same way and all the rest, but as a matter of fact, somewhere in California, someone has an extra bicycle, our world and that world, they don't really differ with respect to the subject matter of I have a bicycle. And it seems to go with that those two worlds can't differ in how it's true that I have a bicycle. If something doesn't pertain to the subject matter of a sentence, then it's hard to see how variation in that respect could be relevant to how a sentence holds or fails. There's actually a lot of tricky issues in that neighborhood. Some people in the philosophy of math have pointed out to me that oftentimes, if you think the way a mathematical result holds is given by its most perspicuous or revealing truth, then it will sometimes happen that the way a mathematical result holds appeals to matters that don't seem intuitively to be part of its subject matter. So some results in plane geometry are best proved through solid geometry, but you might not think that a plane geometry result would have this aboutness relation to solid geometry items. And that's something that we could talk about. But at least in the first instance, worlds alike where a subject matter is concerned can't differ in how the sentence holds or fails. Put it in other ways, anything that bears on how and why a sentence holds seems like it's part of what that sentence is about. Things can't worm their way into what a sentence is about if they have no possible bearing on the manner of holding or failing. Okay, so from what it follows that subject matter is at least as fine-grained as ways of being true or false. And that gives us a lower bound, and then the question is, do we need to go above the lower bound? But unless something finer grained is needed, that the simplest course would be to identify the subject matter of a sentence with its true ways and false ways. And then the main burden of today will be to argue that true and false ways really get you a lot. They're enough for many, many purposes. First, though, we need to take a look at and make not a perpetual, but a temporary peace with Brentano. Okay, so can we explain X is about an object, like, say, Vienna, with ways? And should we even try? So I want to say, well, maybe we can to a certain extent. Maybe we can say X is about O if and only if X's ways of being true and false are ways for O to be. So if I'm thinking about Vienna, then the ways for my thought to be true or false are ways for Vienna to be. If I'm thinking it's lovely in the spring, then the truth of my thought hinges on a particular way for Vienna to be lovely in the spring. Now this is pretty gestural and hand wavy because we may well have X's that are about Vienna that aren't truth evaluable, and that's what I'll come to in just a second. And I certainly don't sort of want to fall into the idea that Searle and others often appeal to here, that all intentionality is really kind of propositional attitude based. So there isn't such a thing as sort of loving or adoring, which is not itself to be explained in terms of I'm happy that blah blah blah. Anyway, why would it be a good thing if we could explain X is about O with ways? And this I just sort of more or less made up a couple days ago, and I'm not 100% sure. Well, I'm 100% sure it doesn't work because nothing in this area ever does, but I'm going to just sort of throw it out there. Not everything one thinks about exists, as we know. Objectual aboutness thus seems to become a relation born sometimes to these entities, sometimes referred to as intentional in existence. I gather from some desperate late night reading last night that Brentano's views changed rather dramatically between 1874 and when he wrote the appendix to that book much later. That I'm not really going to get into this. I'm just going to sort of look at the sort of crude way it's normally presented, that thoughts are directed at sort of, in general, sort of things out in the world, except sometimes those things don't exist. The theory of intentional inexistence is deep, dark, and difficult. I'm the last person in the world you'd want to hear reviewing it. So I'm just going to sort of suggest an approach to this issue that's come up recently as I've been thinking about non-existent statements. So can the ways theorists do without intentionally inexistent items? In other words, if I'm thinking about Pegasus, can I explain that without there being a Pegasus? Can we explain the sense in which that's true using ways, in other words, on the present model, without there being a Pegasus? Well, that depends on whether ways for an entity to be make sense in the absence of the entity. And I want to say that, yeah, they can make sense in the absence of the entity. So, and here I'm using an example of Kripke's. So take Sherlock Holmes. Kripke notices that it seems to make sense to ask whether, if he exists, he has certain features. And it's different. That's different from asking whether if Vulcan exists, Vulcan has those features. So he says, well, this is not his example is the room. So one way for Holmes to potentially be is attending this webinar if he exists. Right? And not only is that a way for him to be, it's pretty clear that he doesn't need to exist to either be or not be that way. And moreover, it's pretty clear that he's not that way. This is not a way Holmes actually is. He's not at this webinar if he exists. We at the webinar, we're all, as Kripke says in his book Reference and Existence, his Locke lectures, we were all born too late. This needn't be an a priori truth about Holmes. Elsewhere, I kind of toy with the idea that, well, Conan Doyle was in fact a devoted spiritualist, and he attended seances, and he, it's not out of the question that he should have had precognition of one of us at a seance, in which case the Holmes book could have been about one of us. We just don't think that's very likely. So all this is supposed to be very a posteriori. You can make sense of indicative conditionals involving non-existent objects, and they can form the basis for our judgments about the ways non-existent objects can be. How does that work? Well, just think about the Ramsey test. Certainly, the Ramsey test says, will you evaluate a conditional by imagining yourself being reliably informed of the antecedent and then making mental adjustments to accommodate this new information? You can certainly imagine someone telling me, you know what? Holmes exists. It turns out, crazy as it sounds, that Holmes exists. And there seems little doubt that I can then regard myself as being in causal contact via my informer with the individual, and I can make the relevant adjustments in the same way as if someone said that an actually existent person exists. So I, for some reason, had forgotten that they existed, or I didn't know that they existed in the first place. So it's by way of indicative conditionals and the Ramsey approach to them, whereby one makes as if one has been told the antecedent is known truth, that we find our way into ways for Holmes to be. In particular, ways for Holmes to be if he exists. So let me just move on. What about non-truth apt attitudes? What if X is the attitude of seeking Pegasus or fearing Pegasus? Well, these are not the kinds of attitudes that can be true or false, and so we can't use the sort of equation that I mentioned on the last slide, saying that you're seeking Pegasus. If you're seeking is true, depending on how things stand with Pegasus, there are no ways for things to be whereby, say, Barbie's quest for Pegasus, there's a Barbie and the magic of Pegasus. In this case, she did find Pegasus. There aren't ways for things to be whereby Barbie's quest is verified, but there are plenty of ways for things whereby a quest is concluded or consummated. And the seeking I want to say Pegasus is Pegasus directed. It's about Pegasus to the extent that these are ways for Pegasus to be found by Barbie. Sorry, there's multiple layers of fiction here. Pretend Barbie's real for the purposes of this example, and Pegasus isn't. Fear is Pegasus directed to the extent that ways for it to be realized, as you say, my worst fears were realized, all involve Barbie encountering Pegasus. I'm speaking of attitudes here because now, of course, an objection to all this would be maybe there's certain sort of intentional transitives like love and maybe adoring could be a problem, where there isn't anything corresponding to concluding the quest or consummating the quest or the fear being realized. And that would be a problem for me. And it is a problem for me. And I haven't really found my way through that at all. We're speaking of attitudes here because Brentano did, but our real interest from now on is in the aboutness properties of indicative mood sentences. So we're going to be trying to make a case for ways-based subject matters, and it's going to be abductive. There's going to have to be some stuff you can explain with ways that you couldn't explain with what was already in your toolkit. We've got worlds already, worlds where a sentence A can be true or false. Should we postulate, in addition, ways alpha plus for A to be true and ways alpha minus for it to be false? You can think of these as in the, at least to begin with, features of worlds where A is true that account for A's being true in those worlds, or features of worlds where A is false that account for A's being false in those worlds. And that's the question. It's a question about subject matter insofar as the subject matter of a sentence is a construction out of its true ways and false ways. So what does the postulate do for us that cannot be done with possible worlds? Well, you have to look at specific puzzling phenomena to answer this. And so what I'm going to do now is go at sort of lightning speed through a range of analyses and explanations that either have been proposed or that might have some initial appeal that miss the mark precisely because we used worlds we really should have used ways. So part of what I'm saying is that we sometimes aren't even clear in our own heads which of the two we're doing. And then indeed there are some worlds theorists who are very open to the possibility of partial worlds that leave a lot unspecified, and there might be room for kind of a rapprochement between that kind of world theorist and ways theorists. Okay, so here's something that I actually proposed at a certain time at a conference in front of a bunch of people, and they explained to me that I was wrong, and then I realized that I was wrong because I was confusing worlds with ways. Well, it's at least one reason I was wrong. So what is it for Y to be part of X? I'm just talking about material objects. Here's a very tempting idea. If Y is part of X and you change Y intrinsically, you will thereby have changed X intrinsically, because there's Y in the middle of X. If you change Y, something in the middle of X will have changed. Well, that constitutes an intrinsic change in X. So the handlebars are part of the bike if and because reshaping them, bending them, say, changes the shape of the bike, or certainly changes the bike intrinsically. Heating the handlebars up changes the thermal properties of the bike, the intrinsic thermal properties of the bike. But, and maybe you saw this coming, I didn't. In fact, it took me an embarrassing half hour to even understand it. Look, this isn't really right, because it's possible to change the shape of the handlebars without reshaping the bike, even though the handlebars are part of the bike, because we can just take out the old handlebars and swap in new ones, and then change the shape of the now removed handlebars, and now the bike doesn't change shape at all. And there's like a lot of things that one could try here. The obvious one is to say, well, you change the shape of, you can't change the shape of the part, though it remains a part, without reshaping the whole, but then you're using part on the right-hand side and the left-hand side. So it's not clear. It's an analysis as opposed to could still be true. Well, but here's the proposed substitution. A way of reformulating the definition in terms of, or the analysis in terms of worlds using ways. Y is part of X if and only if, oh, sorry, blah, blah, blah. I just said what I put here. I haven't yet come to the reformulation in terms of ways, but now I am now. So here it is with ways. Y is part of X if and only if any way for Y to change intrinsically forces X to change intrinsically too, or induces, if you like, a way for X to change intrinsically. So how does this deal with the removing the handlebars and then bending them? Well, removing the handlebars and then bending them is not a way of changing the handlebars intrinsically, because it has this first part, removing the handlebars, that does not factor in any manner whatever into intrinsically changing the handlebars. So a lot of weight is being put here on what is a way of doing something. And here I'll, and what isn't. And so I'd want to say, waltzing is a way of dancing. Waltzing after dinner is maybe not a way of dancing. Why is waltzing after dinner not a way of dancing? Because the after dinner part was in no way a factor in your dancing. And there's a number of tests you can apply here. One is, does the bilocution apply? Did you dance? Did you dance by waltzing after dinner? But I'll use another test that comes from a paper by Angelika Kratzer called "On the Lumps of Thought," something like that. So she gives the example of someone who's spends the afternoon painting, and her friend comes in later and says, "What did you do this afternoon?" And she said, "I only painted a watercolor." And the response comes, "That's not true. You also had a sandwich." And so she calls this dialogue with a pedant. It's a pedantic remark. Yes, I also had a sandwich. So strictly speaking, I didn't only paint a watercolor. But then she has a second dialogue with a lunatic. She says, well, imagine someone coming in and saying, "That's not true. You also painted apples and a pheasant." Well, that is not a correction to "I only painted a watercolor," because painting apples and a pheasant was the way I painted a watercolor. I painted a watercolor in painting apples and a pheasant. And so what this shows is that phi is not merely a way of psiing. If "I only psied" is correctable by saying, "Not so, you actually also phied." But "I only bent the handlebars" is correctable by, "No, you first removed them." So that's why removing the handlebars and then bending them is not a way of changing the handlebars. Or if I say, I only change them intrinsically," is correctable by, "No, you first remove them." Content part. Now, first we were talking about material part, now content part. P has Q as a part, P contains Q, if and only if P implies Q. That's a thing that analytic philosophers have said for a period of time. There's bits of it in Kant. Wittgenstein is pretty explicit. He says if Q follows from P, the sense of Q is contained in the sense of P. And he says a proposition already asserts every proposition which follows from it. Moore, in his commonplace book, actually both Moore and Ramsey in his early review of the Tractatus in Mind, disagreed with these statements of Wittgenstein's. So Moore in the commonplace book, to say that cat's mew contains cat's mew or dog's bark is to give a false partial analysis of cat's mew, since this disjunction, though it logically follows from cat's mew, is not a part of or contained in or included in the proposition that cats mu. And Ramsey makes a similar point. He says that Wittgenstein suggests that FA, just like a first order sentence, FA, includes there are Fs in Ramsey, and also everything is F includes FA. And Ramsey says, well, common sense might agree with that second idea, but not with the first. So the most one can say is that P contains Q or has Q as a part only if P implies Q. And that isn't circular, but it's not much of an analysis either. We'll come back to that. Here's how you do it with ways. You say P includes Q if and only if P implies Q, and all of Q's true ways, every way for Q to be true, is implied by a way for P to be true. There's also an additional clause that's helpful in some cases. Every way for Q to be false is a way for P to be false, is itself a way for P to be false. So let's look at a disjunction. Is a disjunction C or D? It's certainly implied by its disjunct C. Is it part of the disjunct? Well, we've got implication. So the only remaining question is every way for C or D to hold implied by a way for C to hold? Well, no, because, for instance, to use Moore's example, ways for dogs to bark are not implied by ways for cats to mew. And again, that goes with cats mewing while dogs bark not being a way for cats to mew. Is the conjunct C part of the conjunction C and D, say cats mew and dogs bark? Well, that depends on whether every way for cats mew to hold is implied by a way for cats mew and dogs bark to hold. Ways for cats to mew are implied by ways for cats to mew and dogs to bark. So yes, I might as well mention the false way or false maker side of this, of the equation too. Is it the case that every way for C to fail is a way for C and D to fail? Well, yeah, imagine that cats don't mew because they only bark, say. That is a way for it to be false that cats mew and dogs bark. Intuitively, if one thing is part of another and there's, so to speak, a defect in the part, then that makes a defect in the whole. As this is just a cheap, meaningless illusion. But as Descartes says, one rotten apple spoils the whole bushel. Partial truth with worlds. Oh no, this J.D. Salinger thing didn't come out right. Whoops, hold on. Oh, how do I go back? I don't know how to go back. Oh, yes. There's this great quote from J.D. Salinger. Only part of it appears that it's like, this is a great story. It's true, too, but it isn't always true. But it isn't all true. People always think something's all true. That's somewhat my philosophy, that people sort of are really obsessed with whether things are entirely true. As Frege says, half truth is not true at all, which is correct, but it doesn't deprive the half truth of interest if you know which half is true. Okay, so I want to say, here's something that you might try to offer by way of explaining partial truth. If you only have worlds as your machinery, P is partly true if it has non-trivial true consequence. The consequence being something that holds in all the worlds where the thing that has it as a consequence does. But there is no P so false as not to imply any truths. This would make everything partly true. Russell, way back when, in some of his early writings on idealism, pointed out that this was actually welcomed by the absolute idealists who wanted to say that statements about less than all of reality weren't entirely true, but they were partly true, and that was enough. And he gave he took a dim view of this. He says, if we think it is Tuesday when it's really Wednesday, we're at least right in thinking that it's a day of the week. we think America was discovered in 1066, we're at least right in thinking that something important happened that year. So what I've got to say in response to this kind of example is that, well, it's a day of the week isn't really part of it's Tuesday. And something important happening that year is not part of America was discovered in 1066. So that what we seem to have found is that the truth of Q does credit to P and Q. It reflects back favorably on it truth-wise, but the truth of P or Q via Q does no credit to P, but P implies P or Q every bit as much as P and Q implies Q. What's the difference? Well, P is partly true if it has non-trivial true parts, where a part is what I just explained. A part of P is a Q such that every truth maker for Q is implied by a truth maker for P, and maybe also every false maker for Q is a false maker for P. So the truth of P or Q via Q does no credit to P because that disjunction isn't part of P. So there's an implication that isn't a part. The truth of Q does do credit to P and Q because it's a part of P and Q. This makes the way this example kind of makes it look like it's a syntactic affair. It isn't a syntactic affair at all. I mean, it's supposed to be. So, for example, we might well think that part of what it is to be a vixen is to be a fox. So if you call something a vixen that's in fact a male fox, then what you said is partly true. Okay, so the notion has to be handled with care, this notion of partial truth. It's easy to get yourself confused. Here's a poster that gets confused. It distinguishes three kinds of claim: false claim, partly true claim, true claim. But the yellow light there really should be incorporated into the red light, because an only partly true claim is false. It's just that some falsehoods contain more truths than others. So we're really just talking about a sort of finer analysis of the realm of falsehoods. Okay. Common content. So here I really am just like ripping through a bunch of reasons, places where ways come to the rescue and worlds let us down. So you might think that P and Q share content if they have non-trivial implications in common. And since the weakest implication they could have in common is P or Q, assuming that that's not trivial, one might suggest that, and MUMBLE does suggest, that a disjunction expresses the common content of its disjuncts. But is that really true? So imagine that. Sorry, this was late night Wikipedia research. Dario says that Lena Wertmuller makes the best films, and Gina says that Mario Bava does. I don't know who Mario Bava is. I assume you do. Do the two agree that either Lena or Mario makes the best movies? And it sort of seems unlikely that they do. Perhaps Dario's never heard of Mario Bava and vice versa. More generally, the problem with this analysis of sharing content is that P and Q wind up sharing content, unless it's a necessary truth that P or Q. In other words, unless P and Q are subcontraries. So almost always, in other words. So partial agreement is almost whenever two people speak, they partially agree. They agree at least on the disjunction of what they said. How do you do it with ways? Well, P and Q share content if they have non-trivial parts in common. P or Q is not part of P, not part of Q. That's why Dario and Gina don't agree. Compare the case where Dario says P and R, and Gina says Q and R, where R says that European directors are the best. Well, these two do share content, namely European directors are the best. So Dario and Gina do, in the second case, agree on something, in addition to disagreeing on something else. Surplus content, with worlds first. Surplus content is a notion that played a big role in early discussions of what inductive confirmation is, because inductive confirmers are supposed to confirm the part of the hypothesis that goes beyond the confirmer itself. So H's surplus content over E was often defined as the weakest X such that E and X implies H. And we know from logic that the weakest X that does that is the material conditional E then H, or not E or H. Popper says, in so many words, the new information contained in H is expressed by the sentence H or not E. And he has a proof, actually, that I think appeared in Nature magazine or Science, that inductive confirmation is impossible, that says, look, if E was going to confirm the new information in H, it would have to confirm not E or H. But E doesn't confirm not E or H. If you think of it in Bayesian terms, the conditional probability of not E or H on E is actually lower than the conditional probability, than the standalone probability of H or not E. But this is just a bad view of surplus content. What P and Q adds to P, to take the simplest example, is Q. I mean, in most cases, imagine they're just completely orthogonal claims. And that's stronger than what Popper says, which is if P, then P and Q. Take a sentence like, everything ages. That was Goodman's example, but in his writings about aboutness. What everything ages adds to the number 0 ages is not either 0 is ageless or everything ages. That's what Popper would say, but everything with the possible exception of 0 ages. Surplus content with ways. This is not really quite the right thing to say, but it's at least better. So H minus E, what H adds to E, and just assume that H implies E, is the smallest part X of H such that E and X implies H in return. This is only a first approximation, as I said, but let's try to run it on not E or H. Well, we'd have to know whether not E or H is part of H. Well, does not E or H have true ways not implied by any true ways for H? Well, true ways for not E certainly fit the bill here. They're going to be inconsistent with every true way for H, given that H implies E. So anything that makes E true is going to imply the false, makes not E true is going to make E false, and therefore is going to imply that H is false. So it can't even be consistent with a truth maker for H, much less implied by a truth maker for H. So reasons that this cannot be the last word. Well, who's to say that H has any parts with that property listed above, much less the weakest one? There also are going to be lots of cases where E is inextricable from H. Think of red and scarlet. Think of there are electrons subtracted from this is an electron, in which case the remainder arguably shouldn't exist. No, this is not the place to go into it further. Causation. Here's something kind of thing that I used to say. Socrates' death was not caused by his guzzling the hemlock, for he would still have died if he had drunk without guzzling. So just assume guzzling is kind of drinking that's just like really messy. You spill on yourself a lot. It doesn't have anything to do with like drinking more or faster, just to stipulate that. So you might say, look, this can't be right. The mere existence of a weaker D than C that also suffices can't knock C out of contention, because consider Socrates drinking hemlock or falling off a cliff. That happened too. And it's weaker than his simply drinking hemlock. Why is the drinking C not knocked out of proportion with death E by D, the drinking or falling? And once again, it seems like we want to reach here for some notion of part. Just as it takes a true part B of A to confer partial truth on A, true implications aren't enough. It takes a sufficient part T of C to expose C as not a cause. Sufficient implications aren't enough. How do you do it with ways? Well, again, you use the notion of part. C causes E only if no D strictly contained in C suffices for E. The guzzling or falling off a cliff isn't disqualifying anymore because it's not contained. I'm speeding up now because the moves are probably getting more predictable. People have said, and this is inevitable if permission is represented by as a modal operator. Say, yeah, permission to A carries over to A's necessary consequences, and people will say, well, that's why you're something called the inheritance principle. That's why you're permitted to have milk and cookies. If you're permitted to have milk and cookies, you're permitted, among other things, to have milk. But look, having, famous example, having milk or poison is also a consequence of having milk and cookies, and it's not permitted. Better would be permission to A carries over to A's parts. That raises tricky questions, which I won't talk about here. Confirmation, people say, and no doubt this is true in some sense. E confirms, in some sense of the word confirmation, E confirms H if and only if it probabilifies H. H's conditional probability on E exceeds H's standalone probability. But this relation always holds when H implies E. In other words, as long as H is stronger than E, E is always going to confirm it. H is confirmed by all its consequences. And of course, this is found that Bayesians don't know this, but there are plenty of cases where it sounds kind of funny. So if I find a raven and it's black, well, this raven is black is implied by this raven is black and every other raven is white. So therefore, on the Bayesian definition, this raven is black confirms this raven is black and all the rest are white. Again, this is no news to anybody, but you might ask yourself, well, why does that seem like a funny example? Well, here's something else you might try to strengthen the requirement. E confirms H if and only if whenever H implies K, in other words, consider all of H's consequences as well, the probability of K given A exceeds the probability of K by itself. That can't be right because H implies the material conditional E then H, and the probability of E then H given E is always, extreme cases aside, less than the probability of E. So you do want to have something, some way of a notion of confirmation that extends to H's, to things that sort of follow on H, but not all the consequences can be put into that category. Well, the obvious thing to try is whenever E confirms H, if and only if it probabilifies it pervasively, it probabilifies every part of H. And there's nothing incoherent about that, as there was about probabilifying all the consequences. So now we're done. I'm just going to sum up. Aboutness, I've said, is the relation that representational items bear to what we're calling their subject matters. And I'm thinking of representational items as kind of sentence length for most purposes, although I'd love it if there was a way to bring objectual aboutness into the picture. Subject matters are made up of ways of being true, false, realized, frustrated, obeyed, disobeyed. Object directedness, as in Brentano, is different, but can to some extent be reconstructed from ways. And you just say that the object plays it's a way for the object to be that constitutes a way for the sentence to be true or false, realized, frustrated, obeyed, disobeyed. The argument for ways is abductive. Bad explanations in terms of worlds are improved by subbing in ways. But what are ways? That's for next time. And